The Vest Dominion had conquered 43 planets, cold worlds, silent worlds, worlds where the inhabitants looked up at the sky and trembled. But on the night they descended over Rio de Janeiro, during the loudest, most chaotic, most gloriously insane celebration in human history, the fleet commander made one small note in his log. It read, "Locals appear unaware of our arrival." He was not wrong, they just did not care yet. And that was the last time the Vest Dominion ever underestimated a man in a feathered hat, holding a bottle of something homemade. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when the most unstoppable empire in the galaxy meets 5 million people who are already dancing, hit that like button, subscribe. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done when the ships landed, and let's step into this story together. Because it only gets wilder from here. The city of Rio de Janeiro did not sleep during Carnival. It did not slow down. It did not pause for weather, politics, traffic, or reason. For 5 days every year, the entire city transformed into something that defied easy description. A living, breathing, thundering wall of music, color, and collective human joy, so intense that satellites had reportedly picked up the noise from orbit. This year, the satellites picked up something else. At exactly 11:47 p.m. on the second night of Carnival, a formation of 17 Vest Dominion scout vessels entered Earth's atmosphere over the South Atlantic. They descended in a tight tactical wedge, cloaked, silent, and running full electromagnetic suppression. Their approach was textbook perfect, not a single radar ping, not a single alarm. The fleet commander, a four-armed, gray-skinned officer named in Dominion records as Supreme Field Commander Vreth, watched the descent on his tactical overlay with the calm satisfaction of someone who had done this 31 times before. The briefing had been thorough. Earth was a Category 3 world, pre-interstellar, moderately industrialized, fractured politically, and statistically unlikely to mount meaningful resistance. The invasion doctrine was simple. Land and population centers, establish control nodes, neutralize communication infrastructure, and wait for surrender. It had worked on Kala's IV. It had worked on the Breen colonies. It had worked on every inhabited rock the Dominion had ever chosen to flatten. The planet had no idea what was coming. Commander Vreth reviewed his target selection one final time. The analysts had recommended simultaneous landings in several major cities. One team would take a northern financial hub. Another would establish a beachhead in a large coastal Asian metropolis. And the primary assault, the one Vreth himself would oversee, would land in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Population 7 million in the metro area. Terrain, coastal, densely built flat along the shoreline. Strategic value, high symbolic impact. The analysts noted one complication in their pre-invasion file, flagged as minor. The city was currently hosting a large-scale cultural festival. Estimated crowd numbers unclear, possibly in the millions. Recommendation, proceed as planned. Crowds cause confusion. Confusion aids occupation. Vreth approved the recommendation without comment. The ships broke cloud cover at 11:53 p.m. Below them, Rio was on fire, not literally, though the fireworks could have fooled anyone. The Sambadrome was a river of light and sound. The streets were packed shoulder to shoulder with people in costumes that made no logical sense. Men in towering headdresses. Groups in coordinated outfits moving in formations that almost looked tactical if you squinted, brass bands that hit decibel levels that a Dominion pulse cannon would have been proud of. The air smelled like fried food and flower garlands, and something strong that a man named Gary Cooper, no relation to the old actor, just a coincidence that had followed him his whole life, was selling out of a cooler near Copacabana Beach. Gary Cooper was 44 years old, from Tucson, Arizona, and had been in Rio for 3 days on what he described to anyone who would listen as a life recalibration trip. He had a sunburn, a very large hat, and zero awareness that a 17-ship alien fleet was currently hovering 2,000 feet above his head. The first Dominion scout craft landed in a cordoned plaza near the Sambadrome at 11:59 p.m. The ramp descended. 8 armored alien soldiers stepped out in formation, weapons raised, scanning for threats. The nearest group of humans stared at them for about 4 seconds. Then someone in a giant parrot costume pointed and shouted something in Portuguese. The crowd nearest the ship surged forward, not in fear, but in the specific excitement of people who have seen something new and want a closer look. Someone held up a phone. Someone else started clapping. A drumline 3 blocks away, having no idea what was happening, kicked into an upbeat rhythm purely out of muscle memory. And suddenly the arrival of an alien invasion force had a soundtrack. The alien squad leader looked at his troops looked at the crowd cheered. The squad leader activated his translation device and broadcast in the loudest mode available. Citizens of Earth, you are now under the authority of the Vest Dominion. Stand down immediately and await further instruction. A man in a full sequined suit leaned toward his friend and said in English, "Is this a performance piece?" His friend, a retired high school history teacher from Ohio named Dennis Blake, pushed his glasses up his nose and studied the alien soldiers carefully. The armor, the forearms, the rifles that were definitely not props. "I don't think so," Dennis said slowly. "Cool," said the man in the sequined suit and kept dancing. Dennis Blake stood very still. He had spent 30 years teaching students about every major turning point in human history. Every invasion, every empire, every moment where one civilization met another and everything changed. He had always wondered what he would do if history happened in front of him. Now he knew. He took out his phone and started recording. Because if this was really happening, if aliens had really just landed in the middle of Rio Carnival, then somebody needed to document it properly. He just had no idea yet that documentation was going to become the least remarkable thing he did that night. The Vest Dominion had a playbook for every kind of resistance. Organized military. Suppress communications, overwhelm with numbers. Civilian uprising. Non-lethal crowd dispersal, detain leadership, establish curfews. Passive noncompliance. Economic pressure, infrastructure disruption. The playbook was thorough. It had been refined over decades of successful occupations. There was no chapter for Carnival. Squad leader Tav, the alien commander of the primary ground unit near the Sambadrome, sent his first status report to Vreth at 12:04 a.m. The message read, "Crowd not dispersing. Crowd is filming us. Some have requested photographs. One human placed a feathered hat on a soldier. Soldier is unsure how to respond, requesting guidance." Vreth read the message twice. "Remove the hat," he replied. "Establish perimeter, advance on the communication tower as planned." The hat was removed. The alien soldier who had been wearing it watched the man who put it there give a thumbs up and walk away dancing. The soldier looked at the hat. The hat was enormous, bright green, and covered in fake tropical birds. The soldier set it carefully against the side of the ship, because something in his tactical training told him it might be important later, and he did not want to be wrong. The squad advanced toward the communication tower. They were stopped at an intersection by a carnival parade float. It was not a small float. It was a structure roughly the size of a 2-story building, mounted on a flatbed truck, covered in blinking lights and spinning mechanical birds, and moving at approximately 3 miles per hour, in a direction that placed it directly across the alien squad's intended path. On top of the float, a full samba band played at volumes that made the alien translation devices briefly malfunction. 3 soldiers received error messages that read, "Audio environment exceeds processing parameters. Please reduce surrounding sound by 40 decibels. There was no mechanism for requesting that a carnival parade be quieter. Tav attempted to move around the float. He discovered that the float was accompanied by approximately 400 people, dancing in coordinated formation on both sides. Following behind it in a column that stretched back 2 full city blocks. The squad waited. The parade took 11 minutes to pass. Tav filed another report. Advance delayed by cultural procession. Nature of procession unclear. Participants appeared joyful and non-aggressive. They gave us what the translator describes as fried dough. It is unclear whether this is a diplomatic gesture. Recommend guidance. Vreth stared at the report. "It is fried dough," he sent back. "It is not diplomatic." Move. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Sambadrome, a very different situation was developing. Gary Cooper from Tucson had wandered into it entirely by accident. He had been following the noise, which in Rio during Carnival was like following gravity. Inevitable and everywhere. When he rounded a corner and found himself face to face with 3 alien soldiers attempting to establish what their tactical overlay called a population control checkpoint in practice. This meant 3 armored, 4-armed extraterrestrials standing in the street with glowing rifles pointed upward. Trying to look authoritative, while several dozen humans danced around them without a care in the world. Gary Cooper stopped. He looked at the aliens. He looked at the crowd. He looked back at the aliens. "Huh," he said. He reached into his cooler, pulled out a bottle, and offered it to the nearest alien. The alien stared at him. Gary shrugged. "It's Carnival, man." The alien's translation device processed the phrase. The nearest equivalent in Dominion language was something roughly meaning, "It is the sacred time of communal noise." Participate or be confused. The alien lowered its weapon slightly, which Gary took as a good sign. The soldier to his left received a transmission from Vreth ordering all units to move toward the communications infrastructure immediately. The soldier tapped his commander on the shoulder armor. They exchanged a series of rapid gestures. Then all three turned and marched away, leaving Gary standing in the middle of the street, holding a bottle and watching alien soldiers disappear into a crowd of 10,000 people in feathered costumes. Gary Cooper took a long, slow drink. "Life recalibration," he said to nobody in particular. "This is absolutely it." Dennis Blake found him 40 minutes later. Dennis had been following the alien squad near the Sambadrome, documenting everything methodically in a notebook, old habit, and cross-referencing what he was seeing with everything he knew about first contact theory, military doctrine, and crowd dynamics. He had already identified 3 things the aliens were doing wrong. He was working on a 4th. "You saw them too?" Dennis asked. "Hard to miss," Gary said. Dennis looked at the notebook. Gary looked at the cooler. They looked at each other. "You know anything about military strategy?" Dennis asked. "I know that those 3 didn't have a clue what to do when I offered them a drink," Gary said. "Which tells me they were not prepared for friendly." Dennis nodded slowly. "They're prepared for fear. Crowds that run, populations that hide, they're not prepared for crowds that absorb them." He tapped his pen on the notebook. "You ever read about the Zulus at Rorke's Drift?" "I've seen the movie," Gary said. "Close enough," Dennis said. He flipped to a clean page. "Here's what I'm thinking." Whatever Dennis Blake was thinking, it was going to have to wait. Because at that exact moment, 2 blocks north, a Dominion armored walker, a 12-foot mechanical assault platform worth more than some countries' entire defense budgets, stepped onto Copacabana Beach and immediately sank 8 inches into the sand. The walker pilot sent an urgent message, terrain not as indicated on maps. Vreth closed his eyes. Extract and reposition. Extraction in progress, 1 moment. A pause. "The extraction is not progressing." Vreth opened his eyes. On his tactical overlay, the walker's position beacon was stationary. Below it, on a live feed, he could see the enormous machine leaning at a slight angle while a crowd of beachgoers gathered around it. The way people gather around a food truck, curious, cheerful, completely unbothered. One man had climbed onto the walker's lower leg and was taking a selfie. Vreth made a sound his translator couldn't categorize. The invasion of Earth was 3 hours old, and so far its greatest accomplishment was receiving fried dough and getting stuck in sand. Something was about to change, but not in the direction Vreth was hoping for. By 2:00 a.m., the Dominion had deployed 6 ground teams across Rio. They had secured 0 strategic objectives. What they had done, through no intention of their own, was become the most photographed event in Brazilian internet history. The images spread at a speed that even Dominion signals analysts, monitoring Earth's communication networks, struggled to track. Within 90 minutes of first landing, the alien soldiers had been photographed in feathered hats, photographed next to samba dancers, photographed accepting food from street vendors, photographed with their weapons aimed at nothing while a brass band played beside them, and photographed in at least 3 separate group shots where they appeared, against all tactical doctrine, to be posing. One alien soldier, a junior trooper designated Unit 7 in Vreth's tactical log, had been separated from his squad near a crowded street corner. His translation device had run out of relevant vocabulary approximately 40 minutes into the deployment. He had stood very still for a long time, rifle lowered, watching the humans around him with the expression of someone who had studied extensively for an exam and arrived to find it was in a completely different language. A small kid, maybe 7 years old, wearing a superhero cape over his carnival costume, walked up to Unit 7, looked him up and down, and held out a piece of candy. Unit 7 looked at the candy. Unit 7 looked at the kid. The translator offered its best interpretation, offering of small sugar object, intent, friendly. Suggested response, accept or decline without hostility. Unit 7 accepted the candy. The kid grinned, ran back to the adults he was with, and pointed back at the alien excitedly. Unit 7 stood there holding a small wrapped piece of candy in 4 fingers and felt something his tactical training had never once prepared him for. He filed no report about this. Back at Dominion Command aboard the fleet vessel, Supreme Field Commander Vreth was staring at a tactical display that was increasingly failing to resemble anything he had been briefed on. 3 walkers were immobilized, 1 in beach sand. 1 with a mechanical fault caused by what analysts described as foreign organic matter introduced into the joint servos, which translated in plain language to someone jammed a churro into the leg. Mechanism, and 1 that had attempted to move through a narrow alley behind the Sambadrome and discovered it was 4 feet too wide. 2 squads had been redirected 3 times by parade traffic and were now in a neighborhood 12 blocks off their intended route, where a group of older residents had formed a ring around them and were asking questions the translator struggled with, mostly involving the aliens' family backgrounds, their intentions regarding the neighborhood's property values, and whether their ship was blocking anyone's parking. And 1 entire infiltration team, 6 soldiers sent to seize the city's primary broadcast tower, had reached their objective, scaled the maintenance stairs to the roof, and found it occupied by 4 men who introduced themselves as a local radio crew doing a live carnival broadcast. The men had not run. They had offered the aliens headphone sets and asked if they wanted to say anything to the listeners. The lead alien of the infiltration team, a tactical officer who had participated in the occupation of 2 separate star systems, stood on that rooftop with a headphone set held up to where his ear would have been if his species had external ears, and genuinely did not know what to do next. The radio host, a cheerful man named Marcus Webb, actually from Philadelphia, in Rio on a travel journalism assignment, leaned into his microphone and said, in clear English for his international streaming audience, "So it looks like we've got some visitors up here tonight, folks. They look serious, they are armed, and one of them is currently holding my spare headset like it's going to bite him. I'm going to try something." He turned to the alien tactical officer. "Welcome to Rio, friend. You're live on the air. Anything you want to say to planet Earth?" The alien's translator processed the question. It processed it again. Then it produced an output that represented, in the most technically accurate Dominion to English conversion available. This is not how this was supposed to go. Marcus Webb laughed so hard he nearly fell off his chair. The broadcast clipped out for 3 seconds because the audio board couldn't handle the volume. In Tucson, Gary Cooper's mother, who was live streaming the broadcast because her son had messaged her saying something interesting was happening, wrote in the comments, "Gary, is this where you are?" Gary was not on the roof. Gary was, at that moment, standing in the middle of a conversation that was about to matter a great deal more than anyone realized. Dennis Blake had found a phone with a working signal and had spent 45 minutes making calls. Old students, former colleagues, a nephew who worked in aerospace. A woman he had taught 20 years ago who now worked for a government agency he was not going to name out loud. He had not panicked. He had not hidden. He had done what a man who spent his career teaching people to think clearly does when history shows up uninvited. He made a plan. Gary sat on a cooler and listened as Dennis explained it. The plan was not complicated. It did not involve weapons, military coordination, or any kind of formal authority. It involved the one thing the Vest Dominion had never once encountered in 43 planetary invasions. 5 million people who were already organized, already in the streets, already moving in coordinated formations with established leadership structures, communication networks, and a collective attitude that could generously be described as completely immune to intimidation. Carnival was not a crowd. It was a machine, and Dennis Blake had just figured out how to aim it. Gary looked at the plan. He looked at Dennis. "You're a retired history teacher," he said. "Yes," Dennis said. "And you think this is going to work?" Dennis pushed his glasses up. "I think," he said carefully, "that the Vest Dominion studied our military history, our political geography, our technological capability, and our industrial capacity." He closed the notebook. "I don't think they studied our party planning." He stood up. "Let's go find the parade director." Behind them, 3 blocks away, the stuck walker was now surrounded by a crowd of approximately 2,000 people, several of whom had begun drumming on its armored hull in a rhythm that was, objectively, not bad. The Walker pilot, in a report that would later become famous in military history circles, wrote, "They are making music on the vehicle. The vehicle is part of the music now." I do not know how to address this tactically, neither did anyone else, yet. The parade director's name was William Torres, though everyone called him Big Will, partly because of his height and partly because of his voice, which could carry across a football field without a microphone, and had, on one memorable occasion, silenced an entire city block during a rehearsal dispute simply by saying the word "no" at full volume. Big Will had been directing Rio's Carnival parade logistics for 11 years. He had managed float breakdowns, costume malfunctions, street flooding, electrical failures, and one unforgettable incident involving a live macaw and a pyrotechnic misfire that he still didn't discuss in public. He was, in short, a man who had never once in his professional life encountered a problem he couldn't absorb, redirect, and turn into something that moved forward. Dennis Blake found him at his operations table, a fold-out surface covered in laminated route maps and radio equipment, near the back staging area of the Sambadrome. Wearing a headset and a look that suggested he had been aware of the aliens for approximately 40 minutes, and had simply been waiting for someone to arrive with a coherent question. "You already know," Dennis said. "I have 17 radio channels," Big Will said. "I knew when the first ship landed." He looked at Dennis, then at Gary, then at Dennis's notebook. "What do you want?" Dennis laid the notebook on the table. "I want to use the parade." Big Will looked at the notebook. His eyes moved across Dennis's handwriting, the flow charts, the route overlays, the timing breakdowns. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You want to redirect the parade formation to create movement corridors that funnel the alien ground units away from the communication infrastructure and toward the beach." "Yes," Dennis said. "And use the float formations as mobile barriers to block their walkers." "Yes." "And coordinate the drumlins to disrupt their communications because you think their translation devices have an audio threshold limit," Dennis blinked. "How did you—" "One of my drummers is also an electrical engineer," Big Will said simply. He picked up his radio. "You need to understand something. I have 5,000 people in active parade formation right now. They will go where I tell them. They will do what the route says, but I need one thing from you first." He looked at Dennis. "Tell me it's worth it." Dennis thought about Unit 7 and the piece of candy. He thought about the walker stuck in beach sand with people drumming on it. He thought about the radio host on the rooftop and the alien tactical officer holding a headset. He thought about 5 million people dancing in the streets because that is what humans do. They celebrate, they gather, they make noise in the dark together, and they do not stop for anyone. "It's worth it," Dennis said. Big Will pressed the transmit button. "All units, this is command, new route activation, pattern 7. He looked at his map. "Let's move." What happened over the next 90 minutes did not appear, from above, like a military operation. From Supreme Field Commander Vreth's tactical overlay aboard the fleet vessel, it looked like a parade. Because it was a parade. It was just a parade with purpose. The first float formation shifted west on a signal from Big Will and filled the main boulevard the Dominion's primary ground column was advancing along. Not blocking, filling. Wall to wall, lights blazing, band playing, 500 people flowing around it like water. The alien column stopped. The squad leader attempted to push through. The crowd flowed around the soldiers with cheerful indifference, the way a river goes around a stone, and kept moving. The aliens were not blocked. They were absorbed. They were inside the parade, and the parade kept going, and somehow, they were no longer advancing on anything. 3 drumlins deployed to intersections near alien communication relay points on Big Will's signal. Not aggressive, not threatening, just loud. The specific frequency combinations Dennis had noted in his book, based on the audio threshold malfunction he had observed in the squad near the Sambadrome, proved accurate. Within 4 minutes of the drumlins positioning themselves, 2 alien tactical networks went to static. One squad sent a message that read, "All communications garbled. Request repositioning." The request went unanswered. The second float formation, a massive structure representing a golden city, rolled slowly into the intersection near the stranded walker on the beach. The crowd that followed it naturally filled the remaining space. The walker was now surrounded on four sides by parade participants. Its pilot could not move forward without moving into the crowd. His tactical doctrine explicitly prohibited firing into unresisting civilian populations. He had no override option for this. He sat in the walker in the middle of a carnival parade and filed a report that read, "Surrounded, non-hostile, unable to advance or retreat." The people appear to be using the vehicle as a percussion instrument. I do not believe this was in the invasion manual. It was not in the invasion manual. Vreth stared at his tactical display. 14 of 17 ground units were now delayed, rerouted, or non-responsive. The communication tower seizure had produced a live radio broadcast. The walker deployment had produced street music. The crowd dispersal protocols had produced crowds that did not disperse but instead drew more people. He opened a fleet-wide channel. "This is Supreme Field Commander Vreth. All ground units report status immediately." The reports came in one by one. Unit 4, surrounded by parade, attempting to establish perimeter. Perimeter keeps dancing. Unit 6, translation device overloaded. Last understandable phrase received was something about the quality of the fried fish. We are no longer sure what our objective is. Unit 9, walker is stationary. Locals have placed a flag on it. I am not certain whose flag. Unit 11, we have been invited to join a formation. We declined. They invited us again. We are still declining, but the situation is becoming socially complex. Unit 7 sent no report. Unit 7 was sitting on a curb eating candy and watching a drumline perform, and for the first time in 3 years of active Dominion service, was not entirely sure he wanted to file a report at all. Vreth closed the channel. He looked at his second-in-command. His second-in-command had no suggestions. The invasion doctrine had no relevant section. The tactical AI was running probability assessments that kept returning error codes labeled social context insufficient. And then at 3:44 a.m., something happened that Vreth had not anticipated, and his analysts had not modeled, and his 31 previous invasions had given him absolutely no preparation for. The humans organized. Word moved through Rio the way music moves, not in a straight line, but everywhere at once. By 3:00 a.m., every parade coordinator, every float captain, every drumline leader in the city had been reached by Big Will's radio network. They did not receive a military briefing. They received a route update and 2 words that meant everything to people who had spent months preparing for this. Pattern 7. They knew what to do. They had rehearsed variations of it 100 times, just never with alien invasion as the variable. Dennis Blake and Gary Cooper moved through the back streets with Big Will's operations map, acting as ground-level relay points, passing updates, confirming positions, watching the pieces fall into place with the controlled precision of something that had been practiced without ever being planned. Gary carried the cooler, because it turned out being friendly and non-threatening was a tactical advantage nobody had written a manual for, and Gary was very good at it. At 3:15 a.m., Marcus Webb, still broadcasting live from the tower rooftop. The alien infiltration team still present, but now seated on ventilation units, and showing no signs of moving, reported live to his international audience that the parade had shifted formation in ways that appeared, from the roof, to be deliberately coordinated. "I'm looking at this city," Marcus said into his microphone, "and I am watching 5 million people do something I have never seen a population do. They are not fighting. They are not hiding. They are just being here, loudly, beautifully, completely." He paused. "I think that might be enough." The alien tactical officer sitting on the ventilation unit behind him processed the broadcast. His translator rendered being here loudly and beautifully as something close to occupying space with acoustic authority. He thought about that for a moment. Then he did something that was not in any Dominion tactical manual and was not ordered by anyone in his chain of command. He stood up and walked to the roof edge and looked out at Rio. The city below was a living thing, light and sound and movement in every direction. So dense and layered and present that it felt less like looking at a place and more like looking at something alive. Carnival at 3 a.m. at its peak was not spectacle, it was force. The alien officer had stood on the surfaces of planets while orbital weapons fired overhead. He had walked through the ruins of cities the Dominion had taken by force. He had seen the aftermath of conquest on a dozen worlds. He had never, not once, seen anything that looked like this. He went back to his seat. He made no aggressive moves. He filed no report. Down on the streets, the Vest Dominion was losing an invasion it hadn't been allowed to properly start. At 3:30 a.m., Bigwill activated the final element of what Dennis had mapped out, and what Bigwill had refined with 11 years of logistical expertise. It was not a weapon. It was not a blockade. It was the grand finale float formation, the one reserved for the last night of Carnival, the one with 46 individual floats, 12 full samba schools, and over 2,000 performers, and it was moving. Normally, the finale formation moved along the designated parade route in a single column. Tonight, on Bigwill's instruction, it split into 4 separate processions and converged from 4 directions on the central plaza, where Vreth's primary command post had been established. The aliens saw it coming on their sensors. They identified it as organized movement, coordinated, large-scale converging. The tactical AI classified it as a potential encirclement maneuver and recommended defensive repositioning. Vreth ordered his troops to hold position and prepare for contact. What arrived was not an army. It was 46 floats covered in light and color, rolling slowly into the plaza from 4 directions simultaneously. Each surrounded by hundreds of performers in full carnival dress, moving in the structured formations they had rehearsed for months. The drumlins came with them, 32 separate units, some with over 100 players, filling the night with layered rhythms that hit the alien translation systems like a wall. Several devices simply went dark. Others produced outputs that their operators described later as incoherent but somehow emotional. The floats encircled the alien command post without stopping. They just kept moving, slow, steady, continuous, in a ring that turned the plaza into the inside of Carnival itself. The alien troops in the center stood in a circle looking outward, and found only color and noise and humans who were not afraid of them, and not threatening them and not stopping. Vreth stood at the center of it and felt something that his species categorized as strategic vertigo, the sensation of being in a situation where no available action produced a favorable outcome. He could order his troops to fire, but the doctrine he operated under required clear military threat for lethal force authorization, and the people surrounding him were not a military threat. They were a parade. His troops could push through the crowd, but they had been trying to push through crowds all night, and the crowds simply kept going around them. He could call for air support, but his air assets were grounded by an atmospheric electrical interference pattern he had not anticipated, caused. His analysts had just informed him. By the combination of 17 ships running full electromagnetic suppression in close proximity to a city with extremely high atmospheric particulate density from fireworks. His own cloaking system had created a weather pattern that grounded his dropships. He was surrounded by a party he could not fight, in a city that did not fear him, on a planet that had not read the script. Dennis Blake pushed through to the edge of the alien command post perimeter just after 4:00 a.m. A line of alien soldiers stood facing outward, weapons raised but not firing. Behind them, through the gap in their formation, Dennis could see what he assumed was the fleet commander, larger, more decorated armor. 4 arms crossed in what looked like the universal posture of someone deeply unhappy with how their evening had gone. Dennis straightened his glasses. He was 61 years old, slightly sunburned, holding a battered notebook, wearing the same shirt he had put on yesterday morning. He had no weapon, no authority, no credentials relevant to this situation. He had taught high school history for 30 years, and he had, tonight, helped redirect the single largest coordinated public event on Earth to counter an alien invasion using logic local knowledge. And a very good operations coordinator. He looked at the alien commander across the plaza. The alien commander looked back. Dennis raised the notebook. The alien commander, after a long moment, made a gesture that his subordinates, watching nervously, had never seen him make before. He uncrossed his arms. He made a short downward motion with one hand, and around the plaza, one by one, Dominion troops began to lower their weapons, not because they had been defeated militarily, because their commanding officer, a veteran of 31 successful planetary occupations, a decorated field general of an empire that had never lost, had looked at a retired history teacher holding a notebook in the middle of a parade and understood, perhaps for the first time in his career, that he was not in a war. He was in something else entirely, and he didn't have a word for it yet. The formal communication between the Vest Dominion and the people of Earth, or more specifically, the people of Rio de Janeiro, acting on behalf of nobody officially and everyone unofficially, took place at a folding table in the Sambadrome at approximately 5:30 a.m. The table had been set up by Carnival staff who had also provided coffee, which turned out to be relevant. The alien commander's translator needed 11 minutes to process the concept of coffee, and during those 11 minutes he sat quietly and watched the city move around him, still celebrating. Still loud, showing no signs of stopping. Dennis Blake sat across the table from the alien commander. Gary Cooper sat next to Dennis because nobody had told him not to. Big Will stood off to one side with his radio and his route maps because the logistics of any gathering, in his view, required an operations coordinator on standby regardless of the nature of the gathering. The alien commander, whose name the translator rendered in English as something close to Vreth, and who had fought 31 planetary campaigns without ever sitting at a folding table drinking. Something made from roasted beans, looked at Dennis for a long moment. Then he said through his translator, "You are not the military commander of this world." "No," Dennis said, "you are not a government official. I'm a retired teacher." Vreth processed this. "You organized this resistance." "I contributed a plan," Dennis said carefully. "The city executed it. They were already good at this part. I just pointed." Vreth looked at Gary. "And you," Gary held up his cooler slightly. "I brought drinks." There was a long silence. Vreth's translator worked for a moment and produced an assessment of the night that his analysts had compiled while he sat at the table. 17 ships deployed. 0 strategic objectives captured. 14 ground units absorbed into civilian activity. 3 walkers immobilized by terrain, mechanical issue, and parade traffic respectively. Communication infrastructure remained operational and had, in fact, broadcast live commentary of the entire invasion to an estimated 40 million online viewers. The communication tower team had, after several hours on a rooftop with a Philadelphia radio journalist, provided what the analyst described as the most widely distributed alien first contact statement in human broadcasting history, which was the phrase, "This is not how this was supposed to go." It had already been made into a song. The song had 40,000 streams. Vreth set the report down. He looked at Dennis. "How did you know the audio disruption would work on our communications?" Dennis opened his notebook to a specific page, the one where he had scribbled the observation about the translation device. "Malfunction near the drumline at 12:30 a.m. Barely 90 minutes into the invasion. I noticed one of your soldiers' devices producing error messages during high-volume music exposure. I hypothesized the threshold was low enough that coordinated drumming could create interference." He paused. "I was right. You identified that in 90 minutes. I've spent 30 years teaching people to pay attention," Dennis said simply. Vreth was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that his subordinates, watching from a distance, would later describe as the most unusual thing they had ever heard their commanding officer say. "On Kala's IV," he said, "the population surrendered within 6 hours of landing. On the Breen colonies, resistance lasted 9 hours. On every world we have ever occupied, the population's response followed one of 4 patterns." He paused. "You did not follow any of them." "What were the 4 patterns?" Gary asked. "Panic," Vreth said. "Hiding, organized military resistance. Negotiated surrender." He looked at the Sambadrome, where the celebration was still going, would go until sunrise, would go until every last drop of music and light had been spent. "You did none of these things," Dennis nodded slowly. "We were busy." The corners of Gary's mouth moved. Something happened in Vreth's expression that his translator couldn't classify. It was not a smile, exactly. His species had never evolved the specific facial configuration. But it was something in the same family, the involuntary shift of an expression toward something less guarded, something that acknowledged against all tactical doctrine that the situation was, in a specific and undeniable way, funny. "We will withdraw," Vreth said. Okay, Dennis said, this world is unsuitable for standard occupation protocols. I can imagine. We will revise our assessments. Vreth stood. The briefing analysts did not mention the festival. Dennis looked at him. The briefing analysts said the festival would cause confusion and aid occupation. Yes, Vreth said. They were incorrect. He paused at the edge of the table. For a moment he looked at the city, the light just beginning to shift on the horizon, the music still rolling up from 1,000 directions. The float still moving through the streets, with the steady patience of something that had nowhere else to be and no intention of stopping. He had stood on occupied worlds and felt the silence that came after conquest, the specific heaviness of a civilization that had been interrupted and did not know how to start again. This place was not interrupted. This place was not even aware it had nearly been interrupted. It had taken what the invasion brought and folded it into the parade and kept going. What is the word, Vreth said quietly, for a species that responds to conquest by celebrating harder? Dennis thought about it. I'm not sure we have one, he said. We've never needed it. Vreth made the notation in his tactical log. The final field report of the Rio de Janeiro planetary assault operation, filed at 6:01 a.m. local time, read as follows. Planet unsuitable for occupation. Population non-compliant in ways for which no tactical doctrine exists. Recommend indefinite postponement of further engagement. Additional note, the local beverage offered at Checkpoint 3 was evaluated by medical staff. Effects, inconclusive. Taste, unexpectedly agreeable. The ships lifted at dawn just as the sun came up over the ocean and the city turned gold. The people on the beach watched them go. Some cheered, some took photos. One man, Gary Cooper, from Tucson, Arizona, stood with a coffee in one hand and watched the last Dominion vessel disappear into the blue, and felt something that he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately, and would eventually, in an interview 4 years later, summarize as, like watching something enormous realize it had misread the room. Dennis Blake stood beside him. The notebook was full, every page. He looked at the empty sky. He looked at the city behind them, still alive, still moving, slightly less loud now, but not quiet, never quiet. He thought about 31 planetary occupations, and one that didn't work. He thought about a parade that was also a strategy. He thought about a goat named Biscuit on a farm in Pine Hollow that he had read about by then because everyone had. And he thought that there was something deeply human about all of it. Not the fighting, not the tactics, not even the winning, but the simple, stubborn, universal refusal to stop doing the thing you love just because something enormous showed up and told you to. You think they'll come back? Gary asked. Dennis considered it. Maybe, he said, but I think they'll do more research first. Gary nodded. We should probably warn them about Mardi Gras. Dennis laughed. It was the first time he had laughed all night, and it was a good one, the kind that comes out when the tension finally breaks and there is nothing left to hold it back. Big Will passed by with his radio, folding up his route maps. He looked at the two of them. Good carnival, he said simply, as if that covered it, as if it did, maybe it did. The story of Rio's carnival spread everywhere within days. Not just the videos, not just Marcus Webb's broadcast, not just the song. The story. The one where a retired history teacher and a guy from Tucson and a parade director and 5 million people who were already dancing simply refused to be invaded. Not out of bravery, exactly. Not out of military strategy, out of something harder to name and much harder to stop. The Vest Dominion updated their planetary assessment database 3 weeks later. Earth received a new classification. The old category had been Category 3, Primitive Low Resistance Probability. The new classification, added by an analyst who had spent considerable time reviewing the Rio footage, read, Category Unknown. Population exhibits non-standard threat profile. Primary characteristic, does not recognize the situation as threatening. Extreme caution advised. Extreme caution, for a planet of people who had stopped an invasion with a parade. If that doesn't make you want to share this story, drop it in the comments. Send it to someone who needs a good night. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one, and tell me. What would you have done when those ships landed? Would you have danced? Would you have offered them a drink? Would you have grabbed your notebook and started paying attention? Because here's the thing, Dennis Blake was not a soldier. Gary Cooper was on vacation. Big Will was just doing his job, And between the three of them, they helped turn back an empire. The greatest defense Earth ever mounted was not a weapon. It was a party that refused to end. And somewhere out there, in a Dominion fleet database, there is a file marked with a single line that every analyst and commander and tactical officer in the Empire has now read at least once. It says, "Do not attempt to occupy a world while it is celebrating. The celebration will win."